The bitter cold of the German winter pressed against the thin walls of the abandoned airfield. Near Rechlin, the wind whistling through broken hangars and rattling loose panels. Soldiers trudged through icy mud, the acrid smell of burning fuel mingling with the metallic tang of freshly exposed engines. Somewhere in the distance, a lone train clattered, carrying supplies to a front that seemed endless. On this day, a small group of Luftwaffe officers approached a hulking, foreign aircraft, one that had been captured almost by accident. A Boeing B-17 flying Fortress, the pride of the American Air Force, a machine that had already terrorized countless German cities from thousands of feet above the European continent. The men's boots crunched against frost-hardened mud as they circled the massive bomber. Its silver skin glinted under the weak winter sun, a stark contrast to the drab, gray skies above. Every rivet, every seam, seemed to whisper stories of destruction, of missions flown in death-defying raids across Europe. These officers had seen Allied planes before, but nothing on this scale. They felt the weight of history pressing down on them, not just the metal of the B-17, but the knowledge of what it had already accomplished. They had captured a weapon, yes, but also a legend. Inside the cockpit, the smell of oil and heated metal mingled with the lingering scent of gunpowder from earlier skirmishes. Every lever, every dial, was meticulously engineered, precise, intimidating. They traced their fingers over the cold metal of the control yoke, feeling the mechanical strength beneath. One officer whispered almost reverently that it was like holding a fortress in his hands. The plane had been stripped of some of its fuel and ammunition for transport, but even empty, its aura was undeniable. The Luftwaffe officers knew the stories well. American bombers were heavily armed, and the B-17 was particularly feared because of its defensive firepower. Crew could defend themselves from nearly every angle, each turret a deadly eye watching for approaching fighters. Pilots had flown countless missions over Europe, facing flak and fighters alike, but reports of B-17 formations' iron fortresses in the sky had created a mix of admiration and dread within the German ranks. Now, standing on the tarmac, they were about to confront that reality firsthand. The engine room roared to life with a deep, mechanical growl as the first pilot climbed in. Vibration shook the floor beneath them, and a plume of smoke curled skyward from the exhaust, carrying the sharp scent of burning aviation fuel. The officers held their breath as the plane taxied along the icy runway. Every second seemed to stretch, the weight of anticipation pressing against their chests. Would it perform as they had been warned? Or would it falter under German scrutiny? As the flying fortress lifted into the pale sky, it became immediately clear that the plane was something entirely different. Smooth, steady, almost effortless in its ascent. It held the air like a hawk on thermals. The Germans had flown their own fighters, the Bf-109, the FW-190, but this was no nimble dogfighter. This was a flying fortress designed for endurance, for punishment, for absolute dominance over anything that dared approach it. And as the men peered from the cockpit windows, scanning for imaginary threats, they began to see why Allied crews swore by its resilience. Their hands tightened on the controls, marveling at the engineering. Every lever, every pedal, seemed to respond with an almost unnatural precision. One officer's voice broke the tense silence. It's built like a tank. In the air, there was awe there, yes, but also fear that they had underestimated this machine. Stories from captured pilots, intelligence reports, and reconnaissance photographs had hinted at the B-17's defensive capabilities, but nothing could truly prepare a man for the sensation of piloting one. The next hour would be spent testing the aircraft, running through maneuvers, feeling its weight in turns, understanding the scope of its turrets, imagining what it would be like to face its defensive fire. Each officer had his own internal reckoning, admiration mixed with the cold realization that this was a weapon that could and had shattered lives, destroyed cities, and challenged the very might of the Luftwaffe. Meanwhile, back at Rechlin, engineers and ground crews watched from the hangars, taking meticulous notes. They photographed, measured, and debated, trying to figure out how such a machine could be countered. Diagrams were drawn, calculations made, and yet the sense of frustration grew with every passing minute. The B-17 was not just metal and rivets, it was a culmination of design, tactics, and human ingenuity that for the moment left the Luftwaffe officers both terrified and fascinated. As dusk fell, the plane returned to the runway, the engines winding down with a low, almost mournful rumble. The officers climbed out, faces pale, gloves slick with sweat, eyes wide, with the silent acknowledgement of what they had just experienced. It was one thing to hear reports, another entirely to feel the air vibrate under the wings, to sense the potential for lethal firepower lurking in every turret. They had touched history, and it had touched them back with a cold, uncompromising force. One of them muttered, Almost to himself, "I've flown many planes, but never like this." And in that single statement lay the mixture of fear, respect, and awe that would follow these men for the rest of the war. The captured B-17 was no longer just an enemy aircraft. It was a testament to American resolve, to the lengths engineers and pilots would go to protect each other in the skies. A legend realized in metal, fuel, and firepower, a fortress that, for a few hours in winter 1943, belonged temporarily to the Luftwaffe, yet never truly yielded its secrets. As night crept over the airfield, the hum of distant engines and the whisper of the cold wind seemed to echo the same thought through the minds of all present. The B-17 was more than a bomber. It was a symbol, a warning, a mechanical leviathan that no enemy could take lightly. And somewhere in the officers' hearts, a subtle, almost guilty thrill persisted: admiration for a foe, respect for a machine that had forced them to confront the very limits of their skill, and an unsettling realization that, in the air war over Europe, this was just the beginning. The morning of February 13, 1943, arrived with an eerie stillness. Frost clung to every surface, and the low winter sun cast long, cold shadows across the Rechlin airfield. The captured B-17 sat on the tarmac like a sleeping giant, its polished skin catching the first light and glinting like a silver fortress. Luftwaffe officers and engineers gathered, clipboards in hand, ready to push the aircraft to its limits. What they were about to witness would challenge everything they thought they knew about aerial combat. The officers climbed back into the cockpit, the familiar scent of fuel and warmed metal greeting them like an old adversary. As they prepared for takeoff, there was a tension in the air thicker than the morning fog. Every movement was precise, every lever checked twice, every instrument read with scrutiny. This was no simple test flight. It was an encounter with a machine that had already earned fear and respect across the skies of Europe. Once airborne, the B-17's power became immediately apparent. The four Wright R-1820 engines hummed in perfect harmony, each propeller cutting through the icy air with relentless force. The bomber responded to commands with a smoothness that belied its massive size. Pilots who had flown nimble Bf 109 seconds or FW-100 and 90 seconds found themselves both exhilarated and unnerved. How could such a behemoth feel so alive in the air? How could it maneuver with such grace while carrying so much destruction? Then came the first real test: defensive drills. The Luftwaffe officers had heard stories of the B-17's famed armament, 12.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns covering virtually every angle of attack, but hearing reports was one thing. Experiencing it was another entirely. A crewman climbed into the tail turret and aimed at a distant target on the training range. The Germans watched as rounds tore through the air, smoke and brass filling the small compartment with deafening intensity. One officer later wrote that the sound was like 100 thunderclaps in the sky, each shot precise, rapid, and devastating. The turret systems were unlike anything the Luftwaffe had designed, powered hydraulically and coordinated with a sighting system that allowed for overlapping fields of fire. They turned the B-17 into an aerial fortress. The pilots quickly realized that a single attacking fighter could easily be met with fire from multiple angles simultaneously. Some tried to imagine breaking through a formation of these planes, strafing one by one, only to conclude that the risk was nearly suicidal. Each turret operator could cover a vast field of fire, each gun layer protecting the next. The B-17 was no longer just a bomber, it was a floating defensive network, a machine that demanded respect from any adversary. Between maneuvers, the officers took mental notes, whispering observations to one another in German. The placement of the waist guns, the twin .50 caliber mounts at the nose, the tail turret capable of pivoting with terrifying range. They tested banking turns, observing how the bomber remained steady even when executing tight maneuvers for its size. Each revelation came with a mixture of awe and unease. How could such a large aircraft survive the intense flat and fighter attacks that had claimed so many of its kin? And yet here it was, seemingly invincible, a living answer to every question the Luftwaffe had asked about Allied air strategy. Fuel capacity and endurance were equally impressive. The B-17 was designed to carry enough fuel for long missions over hostile territory up to 2,000 miles without refueling. Pilots realized that it could sustain prolonged engagements while still maintaining defensive readiness. Every detail of its design, from the reinforced bomb bay to the compartmentalized fuel tanks, suggested careful anticipation of the threats it would face. The Germans scribbled notes furiously, trying to figure out vulnerabilities that might allow them to counter it. But the more they observed, the more elusive such weaknesses became. Then came a demonstration of bombing systems. Even stripped for the test, The bomber's Norden bomb sight and bomb release mechanisms were intact. The precision with which the B-17 could deliver payloads was frightening, and the Luftwaffe officer could only imagine the destruction it had already wrought on German cities, factories, and supply lines. Each revelation was a stark reminder that they were not simply evaluating a plane, they were witnessing a machine that had shifted the balance of air power across Europe. During a pause in the flight, one officer dared to ask a question that had been forming in all their minds: how could such a plane be defeated? Could a swarm of fighters overwhelm it? Or would it simply shrug off attacks while returning fire? The answer became chillingly clear as they simulated attack runs. Even coordinated maneuvers by 2 or 3 fighters could be repelled with overlapping fire from the B-17's guns. It was designed not for speed or stealth, but for resilience, precision, and sheer firepower. The moral weight of this realization settled over the officers like a shadow. Back on the ground, engineers took photographs, measurements, and detailed diagrams of every turret, every access panel, and every control system. There was an urgency in their work, a sense that understanding this plane might provide a future edge, but even they admitted, privately, that the B-17 was in many ways a step ahead of German engineering. Each system seemed logical, intuitive, and ruthlessly effective. The bomber's reputation was not exaggerated, it was terrifyingly real. By mid-afternoon, the test flights continued, each maneuver revealing new layers of the B-17's capabilities. Speed, altitude, turning radius, defensive reach, all were cataloged, yet each observation only reinforced a single, inescapable truth. The flying fortress was designed to survive. It was built to dominate the air, to protect its crews, and to inflict devastating damage on any who dared approach. The Luftwaffe officers, experienced men who had faced countless challenges in the skies, could not suppress a growing sense of unease mixed with admiration. As they returned to the hangar at the end of the day, their faces were a mixture of fatigue and fascination. They had touched the airframe, felt its engines roar, and seen the deadly precision of its guns firsthand. The B-17 was no longer just a captured aircraft on a winter airfield, it was a revelation. Every officer who had flown it carried an unspoken truth in his mind. The Allied air forces had created something remarkable, something terrifying, and something that would continue to challenge every German pilot who took to the skies. One officer later recounted in his memoirs that the experience left him unsettled. He described the sensation of flying the B-17 as like holding a fortress in the clouds, aware that every bolt and rivet could fire back if provoked. They had faced many enemies in the air, but this machine captured, studied, and yet still alien was unlike anything else. It was proof that innovation in warfare was as much about endurance and protection as it was about offense, and that sometimes the most dangerous adversaries were those that simply refused to be broken. The sun set over Rechlin, casting long shadows across the frozen tarmac, and the officers departed the airfield in silence. In their minds, the B-17 continued to hover, a mechanical leviathan whose power and precision will haunt every strategic calculation they would make from that day forward. It was more than a plane. It was a challenge, a lesson, and a warning. And as the wind whispered through the hangars, it seemed almost to carry a question: who, if anyone, could truly match it in the skies? March 1st, 1943. The cold had softened slightly, but a thin layer of frost still clung to the airfield at Rechlin. The captured B-17, now a familiar yet still awe-inspiring presence, awaited the Luftwaffe officers for one final series of flights. Today, they weren't just testing engines or turrets, they were confronting the full scope of the bomber's potential. Each man knew the stakes. Understanding this machine could provide insights into countering the Allied air threat, but the realization of its raw power weighed heavily on their minds. As the engines roared to life, the vibration coursing through the fuselage was more than mechanical. It was almost primal, a physical reminder of the destruction this aircraft could unleash. Pilots climbed into the cockpit, gloves stiff from cold, breath visible in the frigid air. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then the bomber began to taxi, and the officers braced themselves as it lifted into the sky, effortlessly cutting through the winter haze. The sensation was intoxicating and terrifying. This was not a plane that simply flew, it commanded the air around it. The exercises began with simulated attacks from multiple angles, even stripped of full ammunition. The defensive power was staggering. The tail gunner's compartment, once the domain of fearsome precision, now hummed with mechanical menace. Observers in the cockpit noted how smoothly the turret pivoted, tracking imaginary fighters with eerie accuracy. Each officer felt it viscerally. The B-17 wasn't just protecting itself, it was challenging any enemy to approach at all. The cold reality settled in that dozens of attacking fighters might never reach it before being met with lethal resistance. The pilots tested evasive maneuvers next, Sharp banking turns simulated dives, and climbs revealed the surprising agility of the flying fortress. Despite its size, the aircraft handled with a deceptive grace, almost as if it had been designed to outmaneuver death itself. Engineers and officers on the ground took notes furiously. Yet even their most meticulous calculations couldn't fully capture the combination of durability, firepower, and precision that made the B-17 a fortress in the sky. Mid-flight, one officer voiced what everyone was thinking almost aloud: "It's invincible." The words hung in the thin air of the cockpit. They were not boasting, they were acknowledging a simple, chilling truth. The plane's defensive design, combined with tactical formations, endurance, and sheer volume of firepower, made it one of the most formidable weapons of the war. Even experienced Luftwaffe pilots, accustomed to facing peril every sortie, were forced to reckon with the impossibility of confronting such an aircraft head-on. After hours of testing, the bomber returned to Reckland. As it rolled down the icy runway, engines winding down, the officers climbed out, their faces pale, eyes wide. There was awe, yes, but also a kind of solemn respect that bordered on fear. The captured B-17 had proven itself not as an enemy aircraft, but as a revelation of what modern warfare demanded: resilience, coordination, and a ruthless focus on protecting both mission and crew. Every lever, every gun, every engine had told its story, and every officer had listened. Later, gathered in the hangar, under dim electric lights, they discussed the implications. What they had experienced was more than a test flight, it was a lesson in innovation, in strategy, in human ingenuity harnessed to steel and firepower. How could the Luftwaffe hope to counter such a plane en masse? Would new tactics, faster aircraft, or heavier guns be enough? Or had they glimpsed a new reality in air combat, one where ingenuity and preparation outweighed sheer numbers? The questions hung in the air, unanswered yet impossible to ignore. Some officers recorded their impressions in personal journals, their words tinged with awe. "It is like flying a fortress," one wrote, "with the strength to punish any who dare approach, and the endurance to outlast them all." Another noted the terrifying efficiency of the defensive turrets, remarking that they covered every angle like a web, leaving no space unprotected. These were not just observations, they were admissions of the extraordinary nature of a machine that had already shaped the outcome of countless missions across Europe. By evening, as shadows lengthened and the airfield fell silent, the B-17 sat bathed in fading light, massive and quiet, yet still alive with the memory of its flights. The Luftwaffe officers departed with a mixture of relief and lingering fascination. They had seen its engines roar, its guns fire, its immense structure defy every expectation, and in doing so, had glimpsed the future of aerial warfare. The experience left them contemplative, aware that modern air combat was no longer simply a contest of planes, but a test of strategy, engineering, and courage. In the months and years that followed, the lessons from those flights will influence tactical planning, pilot training, and the design of new aircraft. Yet for those who had flown the captured B-17, the memory remained vivid. It was more than a plane. It was a force that had altered perspectives, forced respect for the enemy, and embodied the terrifying ingenuity of human innovation in war. As the war raged on, the B-17 continued to dominate the skies, its reputation growing with every mission. Allied crews revered it for its durability and firepower, while German pilots approached it with caution, respect, and an acute awareness of its deadly capabilities. And in the quiet moments, reflection, Luftwaffe officers who had taken the captured plane often thought back to that cold winter day at Reckland, when a foreign bomber had lifted into the sky and forever changed the way they viewed air combat. The story of that captured B-17 is a reminder that technology, strategy, and courage are inseparable in warfare. It is a tale of human ingenuity manifest in steel and firepower, of fear confronted and respect earned, of a machine that taught even its enemies a powerful lesson. As modern aviation continues to evolve, the echoes of that flying fortress remain a testament to the profound impact of engineering, innovation, and the indomitable spirit of those who dared to reach for the skies. Perhaps, if you watch the next time a bomber slices through the clouds, you might imagine the hum of those Wright engines, the rattle of machine guns, and the frozen German officers staring up in awe, realizing that they had touched history, if only for a fleeting, unforgettable moment.